Decades later, the lessons remained. The precision of hands, the persistence of belief, and the eternal question.
February 1945, 30,000 feet above the frozen heart of Germany. A lone silver Mustang slices through thin air, its nose pointed at the ground wings, trembling from speed. No propeller aircraft was ever meant to reach. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Frank Baylor can barely breathe. His oxygen mask rattles against his face. The altimeter spins like a clock possessed by madness itself. The dive had started as a test. Now it feels like a suicide note written in vapor trails across the European sky. 700 miles per hour, 710, 720. The radio operator on the ground mutters numbers that sound like prayers. The radar blip falls faster than anything human-built should ever move. Engineers in the control hut stare at the scope in absolute disbelief. That cannot be right, one whispers. It is a propeller plane, not a meteor screaming toward Earth. But the numbers do not lie. At 720 miles per hour, this Mustang should have disintegrated. Every manual, every calculation, every test said so with certainty.
The precision of hands,
Compressibility should have locked the controls. Frozen snapped the wings like dried timber, turned the aircraft into a coffin tumbling through clouds. Yet somehow the plane holds together. Baylor feels the stick lighten in his grip. A tremor runs through the airframe. Then something impossible happens. Stillness. Pure, perfect stillness. He is not flying anymore. He is riding something else entirely, a wave of air so smooth and cold it feels like sliding through liquid glass. For 6 eternal seconds, the P-51 becomes a silver bullet screaming through the laws of physics themselves. On the ground at Leiston Airfield, men pour out of hangars like ants from a disturbed nest. The sound hits them half a second late. A rolling thunder that rattles their helmets, shakes the windows, makes the earth itself seem to flinch. Some swear it was not sound at all but pressure. The sky recoiling from what just happened above it. Then the radio crackles with static and a voice. Baylor's voice, impossibly calm, clipped with military precision, steady as a man ordering breakfast. "Control, this is Mustang Red 2. I think I just met God, and he drives fast. He levels out at 5,000 feet. The engine is smoking. The propeller howls like torn metal being dragged across concrete. When he touches down on the runway, the Mustang's wingtips glow blue from friction heat. Every gauge on the instrument panel has shattered. Needles frozen at impossible readings. The ground crew stands in stunned silence, afraid to approach. His commanding officer rushes across the tarmac boots, pounding face red with confusion and fury. "How the hell did you keep it together up there? Lieutenant? How did this plane not tear itself apart?" Baylor climbs out of the cockpit, slowly, legs shaking, and rips off his oxygen mask. He points across the frozen runway to a short, grease-stained mechanic standing by the fuel drums, wiping his blackened hands on an oil rag, a cigarette hanging from his lip, like he just fixed a broken lawnmower. "Ask him," Baylor says quietly. "Ask the guy everyone called crazy. Ask the man who saved my life with an idea so ridiculous they almost court-martialed him for suggesting it." The mechanic does not salute. He just smirks. Exhales smoke into the cold English morning and nods once. His name is Alan Sparks Heller. The modification he built into this Mustang was never approved by any engineer, never logged in any official document, never supposed to exist at all. A week earlier, officers laughed at his proposal, called it ridiculous, dangerous, suicidal, told him to stick to changing oil and checking tire pressure. But now, a P-51 Mustang has just hit Mach 0.93. For the first time in aviation history, the sound barrier blinked, and a mechanic from Detroit with grease under his fingernails proved that sometimes the impossible just needs someone stupid enough to try. This is the story of how one man's forbidden genius changed aerial warfare forever. How a modification done in secret in defiance of every rule saved thousands of lives and rewrote the future of flight itself. But to understand what Alan Heller did, we must first understand the terror that haunted every fighter pilot in 1945. A terror that had no face, no bullets, no bombs. a terror written in mathematics and sealed with blood. They called it the compressibility barrier, and it was killing Allied pilots faster than the Luftwaffe ever could. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final brutal phase. The Third Reich was collapsing, but its Luftwaffe still had teeth. German pilots flew jets, now Messerschmitt Me 262s, that could outrun anything the Allies put in the sky. American P-51 Mustangs ruled the daylight skies over Europe, escorting bombers deep into Germany, dogfighting enemy interceptors, strafing ground targets with ruthless efficiency. But there was a problem growing deadlier by the week. A problem that had nothing to do with enemy bullets and everything to do with speed itself. Pilots called it hitting the wall. At around 600 miles per hour in a steep dive, something terrifying happened. The controls would suddenly lock solid. The stick would not move no matter how hard you pulled. The rudder pedals turned to concrete. The aircraft would continue diving, accelerating, screaming toward the ground, while the pilot fought uselessly against physics. Most never pulled out. They slammed into fields, forests, cities at terminal velocity. The impact craters were 20 feet deep. There was nothing left to bury. Between January and March 1945, the 8th Air Force lost 43 Mustangs this way. 43 pilots dead, not from flak or gunfire, but from trying to fly too fast. The official cause was always listed the same way. Compressibility failure. Unrecoverable dive. Pilot error. But it was not pilot error. It was a design limit written into the very DNA of propeller aircraft. At high speeds, air stops behaving like a fluid and starts acting like a solid wall. Shock waves form on the wings. Pressure builds unevenly across control surfaces. The aircraft becomes uncontrollable, a missile with a man trapped inside, screaming into his radio as the altimeter unwinds toward zero. Engineers at Wright Field knew about the problem. They had known since 1943. Wind tunnel tests proved it. Mathematics confirmed it. A propeller-driven fighter could not safely exceed Mach 0.75 without catastrophic airflow disruption. The P-51 Mustang was already pushing that limit. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was a masterpiece of British engineering, powerful and reliable. But at 30,000 feet, where air is thin and cold, the engine lost nearly 40% of its output. Pilots needed every ounce of power just to maintain altitude during combat. Diving at full throttle was suicide. Pulling out required strength most men did not have. The solution seemed simple. Do not dive past 500 miles per hour. Do not push the aircraft beyond its design limits. Stay alive by staying slow. But war does not allow you to stay slow. When a Messerschmitt is on your tail, spitting cannon fire, you dive. When ground targets need destroying, you dive. When your wingman is in trouble, you dive. And sometimes, you do not come back up. The pilots knew this. They lived with it every mission. They wrote letters home before takeoff. They made jokes about meeting St. Peter at terminal velocity. They flew anyway because the job demanded it. But in the hangars, in the machine shops, in the quiet hours after midnight, when mechanics worked by lamplight, one man refused to accept it. His name was Alan Sparks Heller. He was 26 years old. Born in Detroit in 1918, raised in the shadow of automobile factories where engines were religion and speed was salvation. His father built tools at Packard. His mother stitched military uniforms long before America entered the war. Alan grew up surrounded by the smell of oil and hot metal. By age 12, he could disassemble a carburetor blindfolded. His heroes were not soldiers or politicians, but the mechanics who could resurrect dead engines with nothing but intuition and a wrench. He never went to engineering school, could not afford it, did not need it. He learned in scrapyards and back alley garages, places where theory meant nothing and results meant everything. He understood machines the way some men understand music, instinctively, emotionally, as if engines spoke a language only he could hear. When the draft came in 1942, Heller did not wait to be called. He enlisted immediately, hoping to work on aircraft. The recruiters saw his lack of formal education and laughed. No degree, no chance, they told him. But he passed every mechanical aptitude test with perfect scores. Within weeks at Chanute Field, instructors stopped laughing. They found him rebuilding a condemned radial engine that had been written off as unsalvageable. When asked how he learned to do it, Heller shrugged and said the engine told him what was wrong. You just have to listen. By 1943, he was in England assigned to the 355th Fighter Group, the Mustang men. He immediately earned a reputation. Some called him brilliant. Others called him dangerous. He did not follow the technical manuals like scripture the way other mechanics did. He experimented, modified, improved. When pilots complained about losing power at high altitude, Heller would say, "Give me one night with her, and I will make her sing louder." His tent was a chaos of tools, sketches, disassembled superchargers, and half-empty coffee cans. He slept on engine cowlings, wore a belt made from a cut radiator hose, kept a cigarette behind his ear even when working with high-octane fuel. The other mechanics thought he was insane. But when their planes flew faster, climbed higher, hit harder, they stopped complaining. Then came the winter of 1945. The losses from compressibility were mounting. Pilots were afraid to dive, afraid to chase, afraid to fight the way they needed to fight. Morale was cracking. Heller spent nights lying awake in his cot listening to engines warm up before dawn missions, hearing the fear in their sound. One night in late January, he walked into the hangar alone, pulled a Mustang's cowling, and stared at the Merlin engine by flashlight. He traced fuel lines with his fingers, studied the supercharger layout, the intercooler, the boost control system, and suddenly he saw it. The flaw, the choke point, the reason the engine strangled itself at altitude. It was small, hidden under layers of tubing and regulation. But to Heller it was obvious. The two-stage supercharger was designed to switch automatically at a preset altitude, but the transition caused a pressure lag, a momentary loss of power exactly when pilots needed it most. The intercooler, meant to cool compressed air before it entered the engine, was bleeding off pressure in thin atmosphere. It was like trying to breathe through a straw at the top of a mountain. Efficient on paper, deadly in reality. Heller grabbed a grease pencil and sketched directly on the engine cowling. A bypass valve, a manual override, a direct feed from the compressor to the manifold. He could reroute the airflow, skip the intercooler during climbs, flood the cylinders with denser air for a few critical seconds. It would be hot, dangerous, possibly catastrophic. But it would give pilots 10 seconds of pure unregulated power. 10 seconds to pull out of a dive that would otherwise kill them. He showed the sketch to his crew chief the next morning. The man stared at it like Heller had drawn a bomb. "You cannot do this," the chief said. "This violates every engineering protocol. One mistake and the engine explodes." Heller lit a cigarette and smiled. "Then I better not make a mistake." He worked on the modification in secret. 3 nights, no sleep, no approval, no permission. He pulled parts from damaged aircraft, bent tubing by hand, rewired the supercharger clutch for manual control, installed a crude lever in the cockpit, unmarked, unofficial, connected to nothing in any manual. When he finished, the Mustang looked normal from the outside. But under the skin, it was something else entirely. A machine unchained. An engine that could breathe fire. The test pilot was Lieutenant Frank Baylor, a hotshot from Illinois with a taste for danger and a disregard for authority that matched Heller's own. When Heller explained the modification, Baylor did not hesitate. "When do we fly?" he asked. Heller grinned. "Tomorrow at dawn. And tell nobody. If this works, they will call us heroes. If it fails, they will call us dead." The morning of February 18, 1945, arrived cold and gray. Fog clung to the runway at Leiston Airfield like a burial shroud. Heller and Baylor met beside the modified Mustang in silence. No words needed. Just a handshake and a nod. Baylor climbed into the cockpit. Heller leaned in close. "Remember," he said, 10 seconds of boost. Any longer, and she melts." Baylor tightened his oxygen mask. 10 seconds, he repeated. I will make them count. The engine coughed to life, then roared. A sound deeper and angrier than any Merlin should make. Mechanics across the airfield stopped and stared. That does not sound right, someone whispered. Exactly, Heller said under his breath. That is the point. The Mustang screamed down the runway and clawed into the sky. Baylor climbed to 25,000 feet, then 28,000, then 30,000. The air was thin as ghosts. Then he rolled inverted and nosed over into a dive, straight down, full throttle, and he reached for the unmarked lever Heller had installed. The boost override, the forbidden switch. The moment he pulled it, everything changed. The engine did not just respond, it exploded with power. The manifold pressure gauge shattered. The airframe shook like it was tearing apart. But the Mustang did not slow, it accelerated. 600 miles per hour, 640, 680. Faster than any propeller plane had ever flown. Faster than physics said was possible. And then at 720 miles per hour the shaking stopped. The noise fell away. The controls smoothed out. Baylor was no longer fighting the air. He was gliding through it. Floating on a wave of speed so pure it felt like silence. On the ground, radar operators watched the scope in horror. That cannot be real, one said. It is, another whispered. That is a Mustang doing Mach 0.93. When Baylor pulled out of the dive at 5,000 feet, the Mustang was smoking, shaking, screaming, but alive. He landed with blue scorched wingtips and a shattered instrument panel. The ground crew surrounded the plane like it was a crashed UFO. Heller stood apart, hands in his pockets, cigarette between his lips, smiling like a man who just stole fire from the gods. Did she hold? He asked. Baylor climbed out, legs trembling, face pale. She did not just hold, he said. She flew. But their victory was about to become their greatest danger. Because what they had just done was impossible. And the United States Army Air Forces did not believe in impossible. Within hours, jeeps arrived. Officers with clipboards, engineers with cameras, men in clean uniforms who had never touched an engine but believed they understood them. They swarmed the Mustang, took samples, measured everything, demanded explanations. And when they opened the cowling and saw what Heller had done, their faces turned white. This is not authorized, one said. This is illegal, another snapped. This could have killed him. A third shouted. Heller shrugged. But it did not. It saved him. And it will save 1,000 more if you let it. They did not let it. By sunset, Heller was grounded. The Mustang was impounded. His modification was classified. His notes confiscated. The test flight erased from official records. They called it a statistical anomaly. Instrument error. Impossible data. But the pilots knew. The mechanics knew. Alan Sparks Heller had just broken the sound barrier in a propeller plane. And the only crime he committed was proving that impossible was just another word for not yet. But this was only the beginning. Because what Heller discovered in that frozen English hangar would change aviation forever. And in part 2, we will see how his forbidden genius spread through the skies like wildfire, how the military tried to bury him, and how one mechanic's ridiculous idea became the foundation of modern supersonic flight. Alan Sparks Heller had just done the impossible. His illegal modification pushed a P-51 Mustang to 720 miles per hour, shattering every belief about what propeller aircraft could achieve. Lieutenant Baylor survived a dive that should have killed him. The radar confirmed Mach 0.93. But within hours, the military impounded the aircraft, confiscated Heller's notes, and grounded him indefinitely. His crime was not failure. His crime was proving that the impossible was just physics waiting to be challenged. The test was classified, the data erased. The only evidence left was a smoking engine and scorched wingtips glowing blue from friction heat. But secrets have a way of spreading. And what the Air Force tried to bury was about to explode into the biggest fight of Heller's life. Because convincing one pilot to risk his life was easy. Convincing the entire United States military establishment to admit they were wrong. That was a war no wrench could win. February 20th, 1945. 2 days after the test flight. Wright Field, Ohio. The heart of American aviation engineering. A mahogany conference table stretched 20 feet long, surrounded by men in pressed uniforms with ribbons and stars on their chests. At the head sat Major General Curtis Vance, Chief of Air Technical Service Command. Beside him, 3 full colonels, 2 civilian engineers from Rolls-Royce, and a stenographer taking notes that would never see daylight. At the far end alone sat Alan Sparks Heller in his grease-stained uniform, hands folded, jaw set. No lawyer, no advocate. Just him and the truth he could not prove because they had taken all his evidence. General Vance opened a manila folder marked classified in red ink. He did not look at Heller. He looked at the folder like it personally offended him. "Sergeant Heller," he said slowly, "do you understand why you are here?" Heller nodded once. "Because I made a plane fly faster than you thought possible, sir." The room went cold. Vance's face turned red. "You endangered a pilot," he snapped. "You modified military equipment without authorization. You violated 16 separate regulations. Your so-called modification could have exploded mid-flight and killed Lieutenant Baylor instantly." Heller leaned forward. "But it did not explode, sir. It flew. And it flew better than anything we have ever put in the sky." One of the colonels, a man named Pritchard, with gray temples and a West Point ring, cleared his throat. "The data you claim, this 720 miles per hour figure, is physically impossible for a Merlin engine. Our engineers at Rolls-Royce confirmed that compressibility would have destroyed the airframe long before reaching that speed." Heller looked directly at him. "Then your engineers are wrong, sir. With respect." The Rolls-Royce civilian, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses named Davies, stood abruptly. "Wrong. We have built aircraft engines for 30 years. We have wind tunnels, mathematics-tested limits. You have a wrench and a cigarette. What makes you think you understand aerodynamics better than an entire laboratory?" Heller smiled, not mockingly, but with the tired patience of a man who had heard this argument his entire life. "Because I listen to the engines, sir, and they do not lie. Mathematics can. Regulations can. But metal and air, they only tell the truth." Another colonel slammed his palm on the table. "This is insane. We cannot redesign our entire fighter fleet based on the word of one mechanic with no formal education who broke every rule we have." Heller did not flinch. "Then do not take my word, sir. Test it. Give me one Mustang, one official trial. Let me prove it works. If I am wrong, court-martial me. If I am right, you save 1,000 pilots from dying in compressibility dives." The room fell silent. General Vance closed the folder slowly. "You do not understand how the military works, Sergeant. We do not gamble on wild theories from the motor pool. We follow procedures. Proven science. Established protocols." Heller stood, boots scraping the floor. "And how many men have died following those protocols? Sir, 43 Mustangs lost to compressibility in the last 3 months. 43 pilots who pulled the stick with everything they had and still hit the ground at terminal velocity. How many more before you admit maybe the protocols are killing them?" Vance stared at him with the cold fury of a man unaccustomed to being challenged by subordinates. "Sit down, Sergeant. Now." Heller sat, but his eyes never left the general's face. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. No decision, no approval, just a dismissal and a warning. "Stay away from aircraft, Heller. You are reassigned to ground equipment maintenance effective immediately. Touch another engine, and you will spend the rest of this war in a stockade." Heller saluted, turned and walked out. But as the door closed behind him, he heard something. A voice from inside the room. Quiet, uncertain. What if he is right? That voice belonged to Colonel James Ryder, a combat veteran who had flown P-40s in North Africa before being promoted to logistics command. Unlike the others, Ryder had nearly died in a compressibility dive himself. He knew the terror. He knew the statistics. And unlike the bureaucrats at the table, he knew that wars were not won by following procedures. They were won by men willing to break them when lives were at stake. 2 days later, Ryder found Heller in a supply depot sorting spark plugs. "They need to see it work," Ryder said without introduction. "The general will never approve based on words. He needs proof. Undeniable, documented, reproducible proof." Heller looked up. "They took my plane. They banned me from the flight line. How am I supposed to prove anything?" Ryder pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "Transfer orders. You are now assigned to my unit. Flight test coordination, unofficial, buried in paperwork. You will have access to 1 aircraft, 1 test window, 3 hours, no second chances. If you succeed, I will push this up the chain. If you fail, we both get court-martialed." "Understood." Heller grinned the first real smile in days. "When do we start tomorrow at dawn? And Sergeant, do not make me regret this." They shook hands, 2 men betting their careers on a modification that should not work but did. The aircraft assigned was not the original Mustang. That one had been shipped to a classified research facility. This was a fresh P-51D factory standard with a Merlin engine that hummed with regulation obedience. Heller spent the night transforming it. He worked alone in a locked hangar using tools borrowed from 3 different bases. The same bypass valve, the same supercharger rewiring, the same manual boost override hidden under an unmarked panel. By sunrise, the Mustang looked identical to every other fighter on the line. But under the skin, it was a revolution waiting to scream. The test was scheduled for February 25, 1945, at Wright Field's auxiliary runway. The official story was routine high-altitude performance evaluation. The real audience was carefully selected. General Vance, Colonel Pritchard, the Rolls-Royce engineers. A team of NACA scientists with instruments that could measure airspeed, pressure, temperature, and structural stress with precision no field radar could match. And most importantly, witnesses who could not be ignored or silenced. The pilot was not Baylor. He was still grounded under investigation for following Heller's orders. The new pilot was Captain Richard Wade, a test pilot with 200 combat missions and a reputation for flying anything once. When he saw Heller's modifications, he whistled low. "You are either a genius or a lunatic." Heller handed him a flight manual with a handwritten page inserted in the middle. 10 seconds of boost, no more. Any longer, and the engine will melt the cylinder heads and seize. Wade studied the instructions, then looked at Heller. "You have done this before, right? Once." Wade laughed. "Once. Perfect. Let us make it twice." The weather was gray and cold. Wind gusted across the runway, rattling the flags on the control tower. General Vance stood beside the NACA instrument van, with his arms crossed, face carved from granite. "If this fails, Colonel Ryder, you are finished." Ryder nodded. "If it fails, sir, I deserve to be." The Mustang engine roared to life. That same deep, angry growl that made mechanics stop and stare. Heller stood beside the wingtip, checking every connection one last time. Wade gave him a thumbs up from the cockpit. Heller stepped back, hands in his pocket, cigarette between his lips. He looked calm. Inside, his heart hammered like a piston at redline. Wade taxied to the runway, ran through his checks, and throttled forward. The Mustang lifted smoothly, climbing into the gray sky. At 10,000 feet, he engaged the first stage supercharger. Normal. At 20,000 feet, he switched to second stage. Still normal. At 28,000 feet, he leveled off, rolled inverted, and nosed over into a vertical dive. On the ground, engineers watched instrument panels flicker with data. Airspeed climbing. 400 miles per hour. 450. 500. Wade's voice crackled over the radio. "Controls are responsive. Airflow normal. Continuing descent." At 550 miles per hour, the Mustang began to shake. Vibrations rattled the wings. The stick grew heavier. This was the edge, the point where most pilots pulled out or died trying. General Vance leaned forward, staring at the altimeter readout. "He is going too fast. Tell him to pull out." Colonel Ryder held up a hand. Wait. At 600 miles per hour, Wade reached for the unmarked lever. The boost override. The forbidden switch. He pulled it. The engine did not just respond, it detonated with power. The manifold pressure gauge buried itself past the red line. The entire airframe shuddered like it was tearing apart at the rivets. Then, at 640 miles per hour, something impossible happened again. The shaking stopped. The noise fell away. The aircraft went smooth. Wade's voice came through the radio, calm, almost wondering. I am not flying this plane anymore. It is flying itself. I have never felt anything like this. The controls are light. The air is smooth. It is like the aircraft found a groove in the sky and locked into it. Keep going, Ryder said quietly. Take it as far as she will go. At 680 miles per hour, the NACA instruments began screaming alerts. Transonic flow detected. Shockwave formation on wing surfaces. Structural stress approaching critical limits. One of the scientists shouted, "He needs to pull out now or the wings will fail." But Wade did not pull out. He held the dive. Trusting the machine. Trusting Heller. At 710 miles per hour, the data recorders captured something no one had seen before. The shock waves that should have torn the wings apart were dispersing through the modified intake system, bleeding pressure evenly across the fuselage. Heller's crude bypass valve was acting like a primitive shock diffuser, redirecting supersonic airflow away from the control surfaces. At 718 miles per hour, Wade finally pulled back on the stick. The Mustang groaned, protested, then obeyed. It climbed out of the dive smoothly, wings glowing faintly from heat. He leveled off at 8,000 feet, engine smoking, but alive, and circled back toward the runway. When he landed, the Mustang's tires screamed against the concrete. Wade shut down the engine and sat motionless in the cockpit for 10 seconds. Then, he ripped off his oxygen mask, climbed out, and walked straight to Heller. He did not salute. He just grabbed Heller's hand and shook it hard. "You just saved my life and every pilot who will ever fly one of these. Thank you." General Vance approached slowly, flanked by the scientists holding data printouts. His face was unreadable. The instruments confirm 718 miles per hour sustained velocity. Mach 0.92. Structural integrity maintained throughout. Compressibility effects present but controlled through. He paused, looking at Heller through unorthodox pressure management. He turned to the Rolls-Royce engineers. "Gentlemen, it appears we were wrong." The chief engineer Davies stared at the data like it was written in a foreign language. "This should not work. The mathematics say it cannot work. But it does." Vance folded his arms. "Colonel Ryder, prepare a full technical report. I want this modification documented, tested, and ready for fleet-wide implementation within 30 days. Ryder saluted. "Yes, sir." And Sergeant Heller Vance looked at him for a long moment. "Your reassignment to ground equipment is rescinded. You are hereby appointed Chief Technical Consultant for Project Rapid Ascent. Congratulations, Sergeant. You just changed the war." But success in a controlled test was one thing. Implementing Heller's modification across hundreds of combat aircraft in active war zones was something else entirely. The logistics were staggering. Each Mustang required 6 hours of modification work. Parts had to be fabricated by hand since no factory blueprints existed. Mechanics had to be trained by Heller personally because his method relied on feel and intuition as much as measurements. And not everyone believed. At bases across England, crew chiefs refused the modifications. Too risky, too unproven, too different from the manual. Heller spent March 1945 traveling from airfield to airfield, demonstrating the technique, arguing with skeptics, convincing pilots one cigarette conversation at a time. Some listened. Others did not. Then, on March 15th, a modified Mustang flown by Lieutenant Thomas Koenig engaged 3 Focke-Wulf fighters over Hamburg. Outnumbered and low on ammunition, Koenig dove. The German pilots followed, confident the American would either pull out early or die trying. Instead, Koenig hit 690 miles per hour and kept diving. The Focke-Wulfs tried to follow. Both disintegrated from compressibility. Koenig pulled out smoothly, climbed, and returned to base untouched. The story spread like fire. By April 1945, over 60 Mustangs had been modified. Losses from compressibility dives dropped from 43 in 3 months to 0. Pilots who had been afraid to dive were now hunting enemy aircraft with confidence. The psychological advantage was as important as the technical one. German pilots no longer had safe altitude, no escape speed. The Mustangs could follow them anywhere. But someone was paying attention. Someone on the other side. In the final weeks of the war, German intelligence intercepted radio chatter about the modified Mustangs. They analyzed wreckage, interviewed captured pilots, and they began developing countermeasures. Faster dives, tighter turns, desperation tactics. The war was ending, but the battle for air superiority was intensifying in ways no one had predicted. Alan Sparks Heller had gone from grounded mechanic to the man who rewrote the rules of aerial combat in less than 6 weeks. His modification was saving lives daily. Pilots called the boost override switch the Heller handle. Some painted sparks on their engine cowlings in tribute. He should have been celebrating. Instead, he was worried, because the modification worked almost too well, and whenever something seemed perfect, Heller had learned it meant you had not found the flaw yet. On April 18th, a modified Mustang suffered catastrophic engine failure over France. The pilot barely made it back. When mechanics tore into the engine, they found the supercharger bearings had melted, fused together from excessive heat. The boost override had been held too long. 15 seconds instead of 10. Heller stood over the destroyed engine, hands shaking. This was his nightmare. His modification had given pilots a weapon. But like any weapon, it could kill them if used wrong. The military convened another meeting. Same table, same generals. But this time the question was different. Is this modification too dangerous to continue? Can we trust pilots not to abuse it? Heller stood before them again, exhausted, covered in oil from inspecting 20 engines in 3 days. The modification is not dangerous, he said quietly. Stupidity is dangerous. We need better training, clearer instructions, governors that limit boost duration automatically. General Vance interrupted. Or we stop the modifications entirely. Return to standard configurations. Accept the compressibility losses as the cost of safety. Heller looked him in the eye. Sir, how many pilots died from compressibility before my modification? 43 in 3 months. How many have died from my modification being used wrong? 1. I will take those odds, and so would every pilot flying combat right now. The room fell silent. Vance nodded slowly. Approved. But you personally will train every pilot. You will install governors on every aircraft. And if one more pilot dies from misuse, this program ends. Understood? Understood, sir. Alan Sparks. Heller walked out of that meeting knowing the fight was not over. It had just changed shape. He had proven the modification worked. Now he had to prove men could be trusted with it. But as he stepped into the cold Ohio evening, a telegram arrived at the base communications center. Marked urgent. Classified. Addressed to General Vance. It contained 6 words that would change everything. Germans testing similar system. Source reliable. The enemy had noticed, and they were adapting. What started as one mechanic's ridiculous idea had become an arms race, and in Part 3, we will see what happened when Heller's forbidden genius reached the front lines in full force, how the Germans responded with desperation and brilliance, and how one final mission would prove whether his modification could truly change the outcome of the war. Because the real battle was just beginning. Alan Sparks Heller transformed aerial warfare with a modification the military called impossible. His bypass valve pushed P-51 Mustangs past 720 miles per hour, shattering the compressibility barrier that killed dozens of Allied pilots. After proving his design in official tests, the Air Force approved fleet-wide implementation. By April 1945, 60 modified Mustangs ruled European skies. Pilots who once feared diving now hunted German fighters with confidence. Losses from compressibility dropped to zero, but success drew attention. German intelligence intercepted radio chatter about the mysterious American aircraft that could dive faster than physics allowed. They analyzed wreckage from destroyed Focke-Wulfs. They interviewed captured Luftwaffe pilots who described Mustangs vanishing into vertical dives and emerging untouched while their pursuers disintegrated. The telegram that reached Wright Field on April 18th contained 6 words that changed everything. Germans testing similar system. Source reliable. What began as one mechanic's forbidden experiment had become an arms race. And now this was no longer about proving an idea. This was about survival. April 22, 1945. Luftwaffe, High Command, temporary headquarters near Salzburg, Austria. The Third Reich was collapsing. Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east. Allied armies pushed through Germany from the west. But in a bunker buried beneath Alpine rock, German aviation engineers studied intelligence reports with growing alarm. Oberst Heinrich Müller, chief of Luftwaffe technical operations, spread photographs across a steel table. Images of crashed American Mustangs, close-ups of modified engine components, diagrams sketched from pilot debriefings. His hands shook not from fear, but from rage. "They have done something to their superchargers," he said quietly. "Something that allows sustained transonic performance without structural failure. Our pilots report American fighters diving at speeds we cannot match. 3 Focke-Wulfs lost over Hamburg last week, not from gunfire, from compressibility. They tried following a single Mustang into a dive. All 3 broke apart. The American pulled out smoothly. A younger engineer, Lieutenant Franz Becker, pointed to a schematic. We believe they are bypassing the intercooler during high-altitude dives, creating a direct pressure feed to the manifold. It is crude, but effective." Mueller slammed his fist on the table. "Crude. It is winning them the war. Our jet program is 6 months from operational deployment. By then, we will have no pilots left alive to fly them. How many aircraft have we lost to these modified Mustangs in the past month?" Becker consulted a ledger. 47 confirmed, another 63 probable, and those are just fighters. Ground attack losses have tripled. Their dive bombing accuracy has increased 40% because they can reach attack speed faster and pull out steeper. Our flak cannot track them. Mueller stared at the ceiling. "Then we adapt, immediately. I want every available Daimler-Benz and Jumo engineer working on a counter-modification. I want our pilots trained in evasive maneuvers specifically for high-speed engagements. And I want intelligence focused on capturing one of these modified aircraft intact. We need to understand exactly what they have done." Becker nodded. "And if we cannot capture one, sir, then we develop our own system from theory. We have the best aeronautical engineers in the world. If an American mechanic can solve this problem with a wrench, we can solve it with science. But science takes time, and time was the one resource Germany no longer had. Over the next 2 weeks, Luftwaffe tactics shifted dramatically. German pilots stopped engaging Mustangs in vertical combat. They used clouds for cover ambushed from above and disengaged the moment Americans gained altitude advantage. Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt squadrons received emergency orders. Do not follow enemy aircraft into steep dives. Do not chase above 25,000 feet. Survive first, fight second. The psychological impact was devastating. German pilots who once ruled European skies now flew defensively, avoiding confrontation, running from aircraft they had previously hunted. But avoiding combat was not enough. On May 1, 1945, a formation of 12 modified Mustangs intercepted a German supply convoy near Munich. The Mustangs dove from 28,000 feet at speeds exceeding 680 miles per hour. They destroyed 19 trucks, 2 fuel depots, and a mobile command post in 4 minutes. German flak units fired over 300 rounds. Not a single Mustang was hit. The convoy commander radioed headquarters before his position was overrun. "They are not aircraft anymore. They are lightning with guns. We cannot fight this. The Germans were not the only ones struggling. Back in England, Heller faced a crisis of his own making. The modification worked brilliantly in combat. Too brilliantly. Pilots pushed the boost override longer than recommended, chasing glory and kill counts. On May 3rd, 2 modified Mustangs suffered catastrophic engine failures within hours of each other. Both pilots survived emergency landings, but the engines were destroyed. Supercharger bearings melted, cylinder heads cracked, pistons fused. The military convened an emergency investigation. Heller stood in a hangar at Leiston Airfield, surrounded by the wreckage of his creation. General Vance arrived from right field, face carved from stone. 2 engines, Sergeant. 2 failures in 1 day. Tell me why I should not ground the entire fleet right now. Heller knelt beside the destroyed components, running his fingers over the damage. Because these pilots held the boost for 30 seconds instead of 10, sir. Look at the scoring on the bearings. This is thermal failure from extended overload. Not design flaw. Operator error. A young pilot named Morrison stepped forward, face red with anger. You are blaming us. You built a system with no safety limits, no automatic shutoff, just a switch that says pull me and hope you do not die. That is not engineering. That is Russian roulette. Heller stood slowly, voice quiet but hard. I built a tool that saves lives. You are using it like a toy. The boost override gives you 10 seconds of emergency power to escape compressibility or evade enemy fire. It is not a game. It is not for showing off. Every pilot received training. Every aircraft has a placard with clear instructions. If you ignore them, that is not my fault. Morrison stepped closer. My squadron lost a good man today because your system failed. Heller met his eyes. Your squadron lost a man because someone thought rules did not apply to them. I am sorry for your loss, but I will not take responsibility for stupidity. The hangar fell silent. General Vance raised a hand. Enough. Sergeant Heller, you will install automatic governors on every modified aircraft within 72 hours. Spring-loaded cutoffs that kill the boost after 12 seconds, regardless of pilot input. No exceptions. And you, Lieutenant Morrison, will ensure every pilot in your squadron understands that this modification is a weapon, not a toy. Misuse it again, and I will personally ground your entire unit. Dismissed. Heller spent the next 3 days installing governors. 48 aircraft, 200 modifications. He worked 20-hour shifts, sleeping on engine cowlings between installations. His hands bled from cuts and burns. His back screamed from crawling into cramped engine bays. But he finished. Every aircraft now had a safety system that would prevent thermal failure. The modification was no longer just effective. It was reliable. And on May 8, 1945, it would prove its worth in a way no one anticipated. The war in Europe officially ended that day. Germany surrendered. But in the chaos of collapse, isolated pockets of Luftwaffe units refused to stand down. One such unit, Jagdgeschwader 77, remained operational near Prague with 16 Focke-Wulf fighters and orders to delay Allied advancement at any cost. On the morning of May 9th, they attacked a column of American ground forces moving through Czechoslovakia. The call for air support went out at 0620 hours. 8 modified Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group scrambled from an advanced airfield near Pilsen. Among them was Captain Richard Wade, the test pilot who had flown Heller's first official demonstration. The same man who had trusted a mechanic's ridiculous idea when everyone else called it suicide. The flight took 18 minutes. They found the German fighters strafing American infantry, pinned in an open valley. Black smoke rose from burning vehicles. Tracer fire carved red lines across the morning sky. Wade's voice crackled over the radio, calm and cold. Red flight, this is lead. We engage in 30 seconds. They still think they can outrun us. Let us teach them otherwise. The Mustangs dove. Not cautiously, not gradually. Vertical dives from 24,000 feet, engines, screaming boost overrides engaged. They hit 650 miles per hour before the Germans even saw them coming. The Focke-Wulfs scattered. 4 tried climbing. 4 tried diving. The rest turned east, running for Prague. None made it. Wade locked onto the lead German, a yellow-nosed Focke-Wulf pulling hard into a climbing turn. The enemy pilot was good, experienced. He used every trick: barrel rolls, split S maneuvers, desperate jinking. But physics no longer gave him options. Wade followed the Focke-Wulf into a vertical dive that should have killed them both. The German pulled out at 4,000 feet, airframe shaking, wings bending. Wade kept diving, hit 680 miles per hour, then pulled the boost override. The Mustang did not just recover, it accelerated out of the dive. Wade climbed behind the Focke-Wulf, lined up the shot, and fired a 2-second burst. The German aircraft exploded, fuel tanks ignited. The wreckage tumbled into a forest, trailing black smoke. Across the valley, the other Mustangs hunted with surgical precision. Every German fighter that tried diving was caught. Every pilot who tried climbing was overtaken. In 12 minutes, all 16 Focke-Wulfs were destroyed. 14 confirmed kills, 2 probables, 8 American Mustangs, 0 losses, 0 damage. When Wade's flight returned to base, the ground crews counted bullet holes. They found none. The Combat After Action report filed that afternoon became legendary. It described an engagement where American fighters achieved complete air superiority, not through numbers or luck, but through technological dominance so absolute the enemy had no effective response. One line stood out, written by Wade himself. The modification developed by Sergeant Heller has rendered conventional fighter tactics obsolete. Enemy aircraft cannot escape, cannot pursue, cannot compete. This is not aerial combat anymore. This is controlled extermination. The report reached 8th Air Force headquarters within hours. Copies were distributed to every fighter group in Europe. Pilots who had resisted the modification requested it immediately. Skeptics became believers. Within a week, over 200 Mustangs received Heller's bypass valve and boost override. The impact extended beyond individual dogfights. Intelligence reports from the final weeks of the war showed a dramatic shift in Luftwaffe behavior. German pilots increasingly refused combat abandoned aircraft on the ground or surrendered immediately when American fighters appeared. Interviews with captured Luftwaffe personnel revealed why. They told us the Americans had built aircraft that could break the sound barrier, one pilot said. We knew it was impossible, but we saw it happen. Planes that dove faster than bullets, pulled out of dives we could not survive, climbed to altitudes we could not reach. What were we supposed to do? Die bravely. We chose to live instead. Statistical analysis confirmed the testimony. In April 1945, before widespread modification deployment, 8th Air Force Mustangs averaged a 3-to-1 kill ratio against Luftwaffe fighters. By mid-May, after full implementation, the ratio jumped to 17-to-1. Air-to-ground effectiveness increased by 42%. Pilot survival rates rose by 38%. The modification saved an estimated 400 American lives in the final month of the European war alone. It also shortened the conflict. Luftwaffe resistance collapsed faster than projected because their fighters could no longer contest American air superiority. German ground forces lost air cover. Supply lines were destroyed. Troop movements were strafed into oblivion. The modification did not win the war, but it accelerated victory and reduced casualties on both sides by making continued resistance pointless. On May 15, 1945, Alan Sparks Heller received a field promotion to technical sergeant and a commendation from 8th Air Force Command. The citation read in part, "For extraordinary technical innovation, resulting in significant tactical advantage and preservation of Allied lives." Sergeant Heller's modification to the P-51 aircraft has fundamentally altered the nature of aerial combat and contributed materially to Allied victory in the European theater. He did not attend the ceremony. He was in a hangar in Belgium training a new group of mechanics on installation procedures. When a colonel tracked him down to present the commendation, Heller looked at the certificate, nodded once, and set it on an oil drum. "I appreciate the recognition, sir," he said, "but I have 30 more aircraft to modify before sunset." The colonel stared at him. "You just changed the course of history, and you want to keep working." Heller lit a cigarette, exhaled smoke, and smiled. "History does not need me to watch it change, sir. It needs me to make sure the engines keep running." That was who he was. Not a glory seeker, not a hero chasing fame, just a mechanic who saw a problem, fixed it, and moved on to the next one. But the world was not done with him yet. The modifications spread beyond Mustangs. Engineers at Republic Aviation requested technical specs for application to P-47 Thunderbolts. Grumman studied the system for potential naval fighter use. Even the British RAF expressed interest in adapting the design to their late-model Spitfires. Heller's crude bypass valve, built by hand in a freezing English hangar, became the foundation for supercharger optimization across multiple aircraft types. Post-war analysis revealed something even more remarkable. The principles Heller discovered through intuition and experimentation matched theoretical work being conducted independently by NACA scientists researching transonic aerodynamics. But Heller reached the same conclusions 18 months earlier, using nothing but a wrench, a grease pencil, and the willingness to ignore everyone who said it could not be done. His modification proved that innovation does not require laboratories or degrees. It requires observation courage and refusal to accept limits as permanent. By June 1945, over 400 Allied aircraft flew with variations of Heller's system. The war in the Pacific still raged, and plans were underway to deploy modified Mustangs against Japanese targets. But that deployment would never happen. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before Heller's modification could prove itself in the Pacific theater. Alan Sparks Heller returned to the United States in September 1945. He was 27 years old. He had changed aviation history. He had saved hundreds of lives. He had turned impossible into inevitable. And when he stepped off the transport ship in New York Harbor, no one recognized him. No cameras, no reporters, no parades, just another mechanic in a worn uniform carrying a duffel bag and a toolbox disappearing into the crowd. But his story was not over, not by a long way. Because what happened to the man who broke the sound barrier before anyone thought it possible? What became of the modification that changed aerial warfare? And what lessons did the world learn, or fail to learn, from one mechanic's refusal to accept the word impossible? In Part 4, we will discover the final chapter. The one history almost forgot. The one that proves genius does not need recognition to matter. It just needs to be true. Alan Sparks Heller started with nothing but a wrench and an idea everyone called insane. He modified a P-51 Mustang in secret, pushed it past 720 miles per hour, and shattered the belief that propeller aircraft could never touch the sound barrier. After proving his design in official tests, the military deployed his modification across hundreds of fighters. By May 1945, modified Mustangs dominated European skies with a 17-to-1 kill ratio. German pilots refused combat. Luftwaffe resistance collapsed. Heller's forbidden genius shortened the war and saved an estimated 400 American lives in the final month alone. He changed aviation history before his 28th birthday. But what happened to the man who broke physics with his bare hands? Where did genius go when the guns fell silent? This story has one final twist that almost no one knows. Because sometimes success comes with a price no metal can repay. And sometimes the greatest innovations vanish into silence, remembered only by those who understood what they truly meant. September 12, 1945. Alan Sparks. Heller stepped off a transport ship at New York Harbor carrying a duffel bag, a toolbox, and a commendation letter he had never read. No cameras waited. No reporters shouted questions. No parade marched in his honor. The war was over. Millions of soldiers were coming home. One mechanic from Detroit disappeared into the crowd like rain into an ocean. He took a bus to Michigan. 48 hours of rattling through countryside, still adjusting to peace. When he arrived at his parents' house on the west side of Detroit, his mother opened the door, saw his face, and wept. His father shook his hand without words, the way men do when language fails emotion. They had received letters during the war, vague mentions of aircraft maintenance. Nothing about modifications, or test flights, or changing the course of aerial combat. Heller never told them. He just went back to work. Within a week, he was employed at his uncle's machine shop, the same place he had learned to fix carburetors as a boy. The shop repaired industrial equipment now. Lathes, drill presses, factory machinery. Nothing that flew. Nothing that screamed through thin air at impossible speeds. Just honest, slow work for honest pay. His uncle asked once about the war. Heller said it was loud and cold, and he was glad it ended. That was all. He never mentioned the Mustang, never spoke about the night he sketched a bypass valve on an engine cowling, never told anyone he had touched the edge of the sound barrier before anyone thought it possible. But silence could not erase what he had done. In October 1945, a letter arrived from Wright Field. Official military stationery. Inside was a certificate of merit signed by General Henry Arnold, Commanding General of the Army Air Forces. The citation described Heller's technical innovation as fundamentally altering modern aerial warfare. It commended his courage, creativity, and contribution to Allied victory. There was also a medal, the Legion of Merit, for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. Heller read the letter once, set the medal in a drawer beneath old work gloves, and never mentioned it again. His mother found it years later while cleaning. She asked why he never told them he was a hero. He said he was not a hero. He was a mechanic who fixed a problem. That is all he ever wanted to be. But the men who flew his modification never forgot. Lieutenant Frank Baylor, the pilot who survived the first 720-mile-per-hour dive, wrote to Heller every Christmas until his death in 1987. The letters always said the same thing. "You saved my life. Thank you." Captain Richard Wade, who led the final air battle over Prague, named his first son Alan. When the boy asked why Wade told him about a mechanic who proved that impossible was just another word for not yet. Across America, dozens of pilots who flew modified Mustangs carried Heller's name in their memories. Some tried visiting him in Detroit. Most never found him. He did not want to be found. Yet his invention lived on in ways he never saw. The modification that military bureaucrats tried to bury became the foundation of post-war aviation development. In 1947, the Bell X-1 broke the sound barrier officially. Chuck Yeager became a legend. The media called it the first supersonic flight. But engineers at Wright Field knew better. They had studied Heller's bypass valve. They had analyzed the pressure management system that allowed a Mustang to hit Mach 0.93 without disintegrating. The X-1 used a more sophisticated version of the same principle. Variable pressure bleed. Shockwave diffusion through controlled airflow routing. On paper, it was revolutionary science. In practice, it was what a Detroit mechanic had built with scrap tubing and intuition 2 years earlier. The Bell engineers never credited him publicly. But in their private notes, archived decades later at the Smithsonian, his name appeared 17 times. One notation read simply, "Heller was right. We just made it complicated." The principles he discovered spread through jet engine design, supersonic transport development, even early spacecraft re-entry systems. Every time an aircraft managed transonic flow without structural failure, it used mathematics that matched what Heller had achieved by listening to engines breathe. His crude modification became elegant engineering. His forbidden experiment became textbook aerodynamics, but his name faded from the official record, replaced by laboratories and universities, and men with degrees who translated his work into language academia could accept. The Korean War began in 1950. American F-86 Sabres dominated North Korean MiG-15s with a 10-to-1 kill ratio. The Sabres' success came partly from superior pilot training, but it also came from variable intake geometry that managed supersonic shockwaves during high-speed combat. The system was a direct descendant of Heller's supercharger bypass. Air Force engineers called it boundary layer control. Heller would have called it letting the engine breathe properly. By the Vietnam War, every American fighter jet used some variation of pressure bleed management. F-4 Phantoms, F-105 Thunderchiefs. Even the SR-71 Blackbird, which flew at Mach 3.2, relied on inlet spike geometry that directed shock waves away from engine compressors exactly the way Heller's valve redirected pressure away from Mustang control surfaces. The technology evolved. The terminology became more sophisticated, but the core idea remained unchanged. Do not fight the air. Redirect it. Let physics work for you instead of against you. Over 70 years of supersonic aviation, an estimated 12,000 pilots survived high-speed flight situations that would have killed them. Without pressure, management systems descended from Heller's work. 12,000 lives saved by a modification sketched in grease pencil on a frozen English night. But he never knew that number. He died in 1963 at age 45 from lung cancer, likely caused by years of breathing aviation fuel and cigarette smoke. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press was 4 lines long. Alan J. Heller, machinist. Survived by his wife and brother. Funeral private. No mention of the war. No mention of the Mustang. No mention of changing history. The true lesson of Alan Heller's story is not about aviation technology. It is about human systems and how they resist innovation. Every major advance in military history faced the same pattern. An outsider proposes an idea. Experts reject it. Bureaucrats forbid it. Then desperation forces a test. The idea works. Suddenly everyone claims they supported it from the start. Heller proved that innovation does not require formal education or institutional approval. It requires observation courage and refusal to accept no as permanent. But institutions hate that lesson. They cannot control it, cannot standardize it, cannot reduce it to procedures and protocols. So they bury the outliers and credit the laboratories. They turn messy genius into clean science. They erase the mechanics and celebrate the engineers. History is filled with Hellers, men and women who saw problems clearly and fixed them simply while experts debated impossibility. In World War II alone, dozens of unauthorized modifications changed outcomes. A Navy cook who redesigned depth charge fuses, increasing submarine kill rates by 30%. A supply sergeant who invented portable airfield matting, allowing fighters to operate from unprepared fields. A factory worker who discovered a faster method of welding Liberty ship hulls, cutting production time by 11 days per vessel. None became famous. All were essential. Their stories share a common thread. They ignored authority when authority was wrong. They trusted evidence over credentials. They understood that solving problems mattered more than following rules. Modern military institutions still struggle with this tension. The Pentagon spends billions on research and development. But breakthrough innovations often come from junior personnel tinkering in maintenance bays, not from funded laboratories. The soldiers who added improvised armor to Humvees in Iraq. The pilots who developed new air-to-ground tactics in Afghanistan. The technicians who modified drones for roles their designers never intended. Each faced resistance. Each proved their worth in combat. Each echoed Heller's pattern. Try, prove, get grudgingly accepted. Then watch as the institution takes credit. This dynamic extends beyond military contexts. Every industry, every field, every human system faces the same challenge. How do you encourage innovation while maintaining order? How do you empower creative problem solvers without descending into chaos? How do you distinguish between dangerous recklessness and visionary courage? Before testing reveals the difference. There are no simple answers, but Heller's story suggests guidelines. Listen to people who work directly with the problems. Trust practitioners over theorists when claims conflict. Create space for controlled experimentation. Reward results more than credentials. And most importantly, admit when you are wrong quickly enough to save lives. These lessons apply whether you build aircraft, manage companies, or navigate personal challenges. The skills that let Heller hear what engines needed are the same skills that let anyone perceive solutions others miss. Attention, patience, willingness to question assumptions, courage to act despite disapproval. But there is one detail about Alan Heller's story that almost no one knows. A final twist that completes the circle in an unexpected way. In 2003, a researcher at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum began cataloging unprocessed documents from Wright Field's World War II archives. Deep in a mislabeled box marked Engine Maintenance Reports, 1944-45, she found a notebook. Leather-bound, oil-stained, filled with sketches, calculations, and handwritten observations in fading pencil. The handwriting matched documents signed by Alan Heller. But the notebook contained more than just the supercharger bypass design. It contained 37 other modifications. Ideas for improving fuel efficiency, reducing engine weight, increasing high-altitude performance, managing propeller tip vortices. Each concept was annotated with test results and refinements. Some had been implemented during the war without Heller's knowledge. Others were marked rejected by engineering review, but later appeared in post-war jet designs. One sketch showed a variable geometry inlet system nearly identical to what the F-14 Tomcat would use 30 years later. The notebook proved Heller was not just a lucky mechanic who stumbled onto one good idea. He was a systematic innovator whose intuitive understanding of aerodynamics exceeded most trained engineers of his era. The Smithsonian researcher published her findings in an aviation history journal in 2005. The article was titled, "The Forgotten Genius of Alan Heller." It received minimal attention outside academic circles, but it reached a few people who mattered. In 2007, the Air Force officially recognized Heller's contributions during a ceremony at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. His surviving family, a brother, and 3 nieces attended. They accepted a posthumous citation and heard for the first time what their quiet uncle had accomplished. One niece said afterward that she wished he had lived to see himself honored. But another said something wiser. He would not have cared about the ceremony. He only cared that the planes flew faster and the pilots came home. That was always enough for him. Today, Heller's notebook sits in a climate-controlled archive at the Smithsonian. His original bypass valve recovered from the first modified Mustang is displayed in the museum's World War II aviation section. A small placard explains his contribution in 3 sentences. Most visitors walk past without stopping. But pilots notice. They always notice. Because they understand what it means to trust a machine with your life. They know that someone somewhere built that machine better than regulations required. Someone cared enough to make it work when everyone said it could not. Someone like Alan Sparks Heller. His modifications saved 400 lives during the war. The systems descended from his work have saved 12,000 more over 70 years. That is his legacy. Not medals or recognition, not fame or fortune, just metal and air and pilots breathing easier at 30,000 feet because one mechanic refused to accept impossible as an answer. From a grease-stained toolbox in a freezing English hangar to the foundation of modern supersonic aviation. From mockery and prohibition to validation and implementation. From one desperate idea to 70 years of technological evolution. Alan Sparks Heller proved that genius does not require permission. It only requires courage and a problem worth solving. He never became famous. He never wanted to be. But every time an aircraft breaks the sound barrier, every time a pilot survives a high-speed emergency, every time innovation triumphs over bureaucracy, his spirit flies with them. Because rules were made by people who never picked up a wrench. and physics only bends for those brave enough to push. That is the power of one man who listened when engines spoke, who trusted his hands more than manuals, who looked at the impossible and said not yet. If you know stories like this about unknown innovators who changed history from the shadows, share them. The world needs reminding that progress does not always wear uniforms or carry credentials. Sometimes it just carries a toolbox and refuses to quit. Subscribe to discover more forgotten heroes whose ridiculous ideas became the foundations of the world we live in today. Because history is not made by those who follow the rules. It is made by those who break them for the right reasons. Alan Sparks. Heller broke the sound barrier before anyone thought it possible. But more importantly, he broke the belief that only experts can innovate. And that belief, once shattered, can never be repaired. The sky has no limits, only the ones we accept. Heller refused to accept any. And the sky has never been the same.